The crowd shuffled past the towering stone memorial, their eyes fleeting, whispers barely audible. One man stood still, silent, tracing each name with trembling fingers. "He knows them all," someone muttered, disbelief trembling in their voice. Every carved letter seemed to speak to him, yet no one knew why. Survivor, hero, witness. He carried more than memories. He carried guilt. And today, the silence would be broken. The memorial stood like a fortress of stone, cold and indifferent, yet alive with the echoes of those who had fallen. Families wandered slowly among the granite monoliths, each name a small thunderclap, in a world that often forgot too quickly. Among them, a stranger moved, quiet, deliberate, each step measured as if the ground itself demanded his attention. He did not look at the sun, the sky, or the scattered flowers. He looked only at the names etched into permanence. And somehow, he knew each one. The murmur of the crowd felt shallow, unworthy, to someone who had seen the weight of sacrifice firsthand. Mothers whispered to children, couples held hands, yet none dared approach him. They noticed the taut lines around his eyes, the shoulders slightly hunched, and the trembling of his hands as he touched the cold stone. He was not like them, and they knew it. He carried the presence of memory itself. No one knew his name. They did not know that he had been a soldier, a survivor of a battle that had left ghosts where men had once stood. His uniform was long gone, replaced by a simple jacket, but his bearing remained intact, silent, disciplined, and impossible to ignore. He traced the carved letters with reverence, lips moving slightly, murmuring words that no one else could hear. There was a sorrow in his eyes that demanded acknowledgement, though few were brave enough to give it. He had been young when the war began, too young to fully comprehend the weight of orders or the shadow of loss. Yet he had felt it in the fire that singed the night sky, in the screams that echoed across trenches, in the stillness after the guns finally fell silent. Each comrade he had lost was a thread pulled from the tapestry of his soul, leaving him raw, unsteady, haunted. He could recall the smell of smoke, the metallic tang of blood, the wet earth beneath his boots, and the faces of those who had fallen beside him. Every night, those faces returned, not as dreams, but as accusations. He returned home carrying more than a uniform. He carried a guilt heavier than any medal, heavier than any public ceremony could weigh. Survivor's guilt became his constant companion, whispering at dawn and dusk, reminding him of promises he had failed to keep. He knew that forgetting was a betrayal, that letting time erode memory was a crime against those who had given everything. And so he came to the memorial each year, tracing names, touching stone, speaking to the absent, keeping the sacred duty alive. The world moved on. Politicians spoke of heroism in abstract terms, crowds celebrated victories, but the personal weight of loss was unshared. He bore it alone, and yet there was a quiet strength in him, an unspoken defiance, a refusal to let grief become resentment or despair. His eyes, though tired, burned with an inner fire. The memory of those lost was sacred, and he would be its guardian. On this particular day, the memorial was crowded with tourists and casual visitors. Conversations buzzed like insects over the stone. Cameras clicked, shoes scraped against concrete. A group of teenagers, loud and careless, stepped near him, their words sharp, their respect absent. One mocked the solemnity, joking about names he could not even pronounce. Another bumped against him accidentally, laughing without apology. He said nothing, not because he could not, but because silence carried weight no shout could match. He remained calm, the tremor in his hands the only hint of the storm within. Around him, the public seemed to condone their rudeness through inattention. Authority figures walked past, noting nothing, offering no correction. It was not malice alone that threatened the sanctity of memory. It was indifference, a social neglect that had the power to wound as deeply as any weapon. Even as the crowd continued its careless dance, a subtle tension arose. Some sensed the presence of someone extraordinary. A few paused, curious, watching the stranger trace the names with what could only be called devotion. The air around him seemed heavier, charged with a quiet intensity, a moral gravity that made conversation awkward. The teenagers grew bolder. One grabbed a piece of flour from the memorial, tossing it aside. Laughter followed. The stranger did not flinch. Instead, he pressed both palms to the stone, bending slightly, murmuring a name under his breath. In that whisper was accusation and forgiveness intertwined. The air shifted imperceptibly. Those who had mocked him felt a chill, a subtle weight pressing upon their conscience. A hidden ally emerged, a retired military officer who had been watching from a distance. His eyes met the stranger's, and in that glance, past understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared history. Together, though unspoken, they carried the moral authority of experience. It was not confrontation that would deliver justice, but the quiet assertion of honor. He moved slowly, deliberately. Each name he touched a pulse in the living memory of the fallen. The teenagers noticed it now, though they could not articulate why their laughter faltered. They felt an invisible presence, a silent judgment that made the frivolity impossible to continue. The world around them seemed to slow, the air thickening with moral weight. Then came the moment that shifted everything. The stranger lifted his head, eyes sweeping across the crowd. A hush descended, almost imperceptible but absolute. His hand lingered on the name of a young man who had been the same age as one of the mocking teens. The officer stepped closer, nodding subtly, and the teenagers, suddenly aware of the depth of what they had disrespected, shrank back. No words were needed. The stranger's silent authority, reinforced by the presence of someone who had shared his sacrifices, held the room. Families nearby straightened, sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the careless tourists lowered their cameras. Respect had returned, not through scolding, not through anger, but through unshakable, undeniable dignity. One of the teenagers whispered, almost to himself, "I didn't know." And in that single admission lay the beginning of understanding. By the end of the day, the crowd had shifted. Parents held their children closer, guiding them to the stones. Photographs were put aside. Eyes were lowered. Flowers were straightened. The teenagers, once loud and brash, lingered at the edge, their expressions unguarded, respectful, transformed. The stranger turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the memorial one last time, and a deep, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Around him, the world had paused, acknowledging the invisible debt owed to those whose names were etched in stone. Apologies, soft and hesitant, came from those who had laughed. Flowers were replaced carefully, and the memorial regained the solemn serenity it had been denied. For a brief, perfect moment, silence itself became the loudest statement of honor. The stranger walked away slowly, each step measured, each breath steady. Behind him, the memorial stood eternal, names glowing softly in the fading light. He had not asked for recognition. He had not sought applause. His victory was moral, spiritual, human. Memory had been honored, dignity restored. In a world that rushes past its heroes, some battles are fought quietly, without notice, and some victories are seen only by those willing to look closely. Today he reminded the world that silent strength carries more power than noise, and that remembrance is a sacred duty. Wherever you are watching from, think of the ones who gave everything without expectation. Reflect on the moments when silence is louder than words. And remember, honoring those who came before us is a choice that defines us all. Comment below with your thoughts. Share the story with someone who needs this reminder, and subscribe for more stories that honor the silent heroes among us.